Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to George Croft's American Music Show. Today we are diving into the life and career of the legendary Vern Gosdin, so please stick around. Alright, but first I've got some dates coming up, so come on out and see me. We will be, let's see here, October 16th is the big trip to Nashville. I'll be playing on the Ryman Plaza stage ahead of the Jason Isbell show, so that's going to be great. And then November 1st, I'll be at the R-Wagon Bar in Browns Valley for a Halloween party. And then November 11th, I'll be at Harrah's, Northern California in Ione. So come on out and see me. We are also brought to you by Tyler & Co. Marketing, providing top-notch photography and videography services to Northern California. Tyler & Co. is your one-stop shop for social media content, product videos, commercials, promotional videos, and best of all, weddings and events. I dare you to take a quick scroll down their Instagram page at Tyler & Co. _marketing and tell me it doesn't look like a Hollywood production. If you want people to ask you who the executive producer of your wedding was, call Tyler & Co. If you want it to look like you got paid just to be in your wedding photos, call Tyler & Co. If you want the video of your first dance to look like it qualified you for the Screen Actors Guild, call Tyler & Co. And best of all, your future father-in-law is going to forgive you for everything. Everything when he finds out how much money you're saving him on this wedding by using Tyler & Co. Marketing to capture your big day. So visit tylerandcofilms.com for all your photography needs. That's tylerandcofilms.com. Alright, so Vern Gosdin is one of these characters in American music that definitely, he was kind of a late bloomer as far as his peak of success would go. And he's not as well known in music history as I feel like he should be, because he was, first of all, wildly talented. I mean, he earned the nickname The Voice. And to hold that nickname in the period of time where he's operating, I mean, he's up against some of the most legendary voices in American music ever. And he landed that nickname because he was just, the depth of his voice, his control, his ability to convey emotion was just top notch. And he was a really interesting guy. I mean, he's, got plenty of wild events going on here and some cool people that he runs into. So, he's born in 1934, and that's something to kind of keep in mind here, because he's older than Elvis, so he'll later run into he doesn't run into Elvis that I know of, but he'll run into like George Jones and Merle Haggard and all these people, and when he meets them, his relationship with them is kind of this, like, they're ahead of him on the track by a lot, and, career-wise and everything. But he's older than them. So he had this weird break in his career. So, by the time he comes back around, he's kind of he's a mix of, like, people starting to know who he is, but he's also, like, this old-timer character by the time that happens. But anyway, so he's born in 1934 in Alabama. And he was born, his parents owned a farm. He called it the Rock Farm, and I think it was like they were in the gravel business or something. And he grew up in Alabama working for his parents. Now, there's not a lot of information available about his childhood. Apparently, it wasn't that great, because in one of his ex-wives later writes a book, and she describes Vern as being a guy that, like, never got over his childhood trauma. So there's something going on there, some kind of abuse, some kind of whatever it was. It was something that Vern never got over, but there's not a lot of detail on what was going on there. But he was one of 9 kids. The last of the 9, I guess, was died shortly after childbirth. So he grew up as one of 8, and they were a pretty standard Alabama, deep South church-going family, where the kids all grew up learning harmonies and singing in church. I think his mom was the piano player for the church they went to. And so they were music was an escape for them early on. And, but, and he's playing like he's doing small gigs and stuff with his brothers and kind of getting through childhood here in the Deep South. Then in 1950, or in early 50s, I think 1953, he moves to Atlanta, and he's working side jobs, and he's singing at night kind of thing. And then at some point in here, he moves to Chicago. Now, there's not a lot of detail around what he's doing here at the time, but an interesting story here, though. So he moves to Chicago and somehow manages to own a third interest in a nightclub. I think it was called the D&G Tap Bar. I'm not exactly sure how he scraped up enough money to own a third interest in a business like that at that age, but he does. And there's an interesting story here. I heard him in an interview talking about he hired Buford Pusser as a bouncer in this nightclub, and this was before. Now, if you don't know who Buford Pusser is, he has a crazy story. That's the Walking Tall guy. I think they made 3 movies in the 70s about Buford Pusser, because he was like this, classic corruption came to town and the sheriff just, starts knocking heads together and cleaning up the streets kind of guy. And he gets savagely attacked and cut to pieces, and he survives the whole thing. Buford Pusser's story is crazy. But before all that happened, when he was in his 20s, I think he was 22 or something, he was working for Vern Gosdin in Chicago as a bouncer. And that nightclub deal goes south pretty quick here, because you can imagine in Chicago in the 50s, the guy who had previously owned that nightclub apparently was paying off the entire police department. He basically had the cops in the bag the whole time. And they were putting a lot of pressure on Vern and whoever. I don't think his brother owned the other interest in that. I think Vern was the only Gosdin involved in this thing. I could be wrong about that. But anyway, so the cops wanted to basically charge them money for protection. And when they came around to collect their money, Vern said no and, wasn't going to play that game. So the cops went out and found they came upon a drunk 16-year-old somewhere else in town. At least this is how Vern tells the story. The cops brought this 16-year-old kid who was already drunk into Vern's establishment, then popped Vern for serving an underage guy. He lost his business license, and now he's done in Chicago. So he kind of gets run out of Chicago by, a corrupt police force. So he goes, this is the late 50s. Him and his brother Rex end up moving to Southern California to kind of pursue the music dream. And they immediately run into, I don't know about immediately, but pretty quick here, they run into some pretty unique characters. And we're starting to bounce off our other stories here. So they're in Southern California in 1961. They join or start a bluegrass group called the Golden State Boys. And this is, they're heavy banjo picking. This is their style of music they grew up with. They just moved to Southern California. And pretty quick, another guy joins that band, and his name is Chris Hillman. Now, we've talked about Chris Hillman in the past. He's the one of the founding members of the Byrds. This is just before that happened. So Chris Hillman ends up in this quartet, the Golden State Boys. And I don't know if it's just through his force of personality or how this happens, but pretty quick, that quartet changes its name to the Hillmen, Hillmen. So it's a play on Hillman's name. And that, continues for a while. And so then I think in 1964, I think that's right. 1964, Chris Hillman he had started, the Byrds was kind of like a side project while he was with Vern and Rex. And then he decides to jump both feet into the Byrds. Now, some places you read that, he offered to have Vern come with him, but Vern said no. I don't know if that's how true that is, but because it doesn't sound like that offer was extended to Rex. So Vern says, nope, I'm going to stick with my brother. They start, so as the Byrds start, in the same, span of time, Vern and his brother Rex start performing as the Gosdin Brothers. But they're in that same orbit. So when we talked about in our Graham Parsons episode, kind of when he's showing up to town and kind of what shape the Byrds are in and kind of how all these people are bouncing off of each other, Vern and Rex are knee deep in that whole scene. And they actually end up touring as an opening act for the Byrds for part of this deal. And so they also, so Gene Clark is another one of the Byrds. So as this whole thing is going on, they're around each other enough. They've befriended almost all the members of the Byrds. I haven't found anywhere where Vern is talking directly about Graham Parsons. It's probably out there, but I can't find a lot of them interacting with each other. Vern and Rex, however, were very close with Clarence White. Now, Clarence White, if you remember from our Graham Parsons episode, is the guy who, many years later, Clarence was loading gear into the back of the band's truck or whatever and gets hit by a drunk driver and killed. And it's his funeral that Graham Parsons is at with Phil Kaufman when Graham says, don't ever let them do this to me, which is where they decide to light Graham on fire after he dies. So that's the connection to this story. Clarence White, who, stayed, later became part of the Byrds, is tight with Vern and Rex Gosdin. So, and they're singing harmonies for him. They're helping out with recordings. They're all kind of the same. It's all the same scene. And, but then, Vern had to have met Graham Parsons because Vern wrote a song that ended up on the Sweetheart of the Rodeo album, which I think, I wrote that song down and I can't remember where I wrote it. Anyway. It'll come to me here in a little bit. Someone to Turn To is the name of the song. So Vern wrote Someone to Turn To, and it ends up on the Sweetheart of the Rodeo album, which, as we talked about in our Graham Parsons episode, that whole album was basically Graham Parsons rebranding the Byrds. It's the only album he was really with them for, and that's why the sound on that album is so different than any other Byrds album you're going to ever find. Well, Vern is tangentially attached to that whole process here. So, but he stays close with Chris Hillman, and he's kind of, in the scene there. And then, to the point where Gene Clark does a solo album, which self-titled, it's Gene Clark. The title of the album is Gene Clark, subtitle is With the Gosdin Brothers. So Gene Clark's whole album, the harmonies and the background vocals and stuff, is all Rex and Vern Gosdin. So they're just tied in here with the Byrds and all those people that are around. And then the Gosdin Brothers released their debut album called Sounds of Goodbye in 1968. Now this is also where we get another character enters the scene here pretty early on. And I think it was on that album with Gene Clark. Is a producer named Gary S. Paxton. Now, Gary S. Paxton is a strange character in the whole LA scene at the time. It kind of depends on who you talk to. Most people seem to have regarded him as a nice guy and a bit of a business shark, but overall a good dude. But I think Phil Spector, who had a bit of a more nasty reputation as even more of a shark, was noted as saying that he was scared of Gary Paxton, just out of his, just as a business competitor, it sounded like, more than anything. But anyway, so this is where Paxton enters the scene. And Paxton is also bouncing off all these guys, and he's also working with Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys. He's kind of tied into all this stuff. He's not really I don't think he's producing Beach Boys albums, but there was some mutual respect between Brian Wilson and him, because I think the Beach Boys were working with Spector. So that we're starting to see the web of attachments start here. And this is in the early 70s. It'll become an issue many years later. So, 1970, 68 was the Gosdin Brothers album. Now, things kind of dry up for Vern here. For whatever reason, I don't know if it was just the pressures of the music business or what, but Vern basically calls it quits, and he moves, I think, back to Alabama. No, he moves to Georgia. He goes to Atlanta with his family and starts working in like a glass factory. They were making like mirrors and whatever. And he does that for like 6 years or something. There's a good span of time here where he's just removed himself from the music scene. And the reasons for that are not immediately clear, but then let's see here. I think he comes back in 1976 because he signs with Elektra Records. Now, the way his re-entry into the music scene, so like I said, he's been gone for 6 years. And in that 6 years, lots of stuff is going on. This is kind of while Vern's gone, this is where the Byrds are really taking off. Graham Parsons is getting involved. I can't remember. I think Graham Parsons died in 1973, I think, which is like right in here. So Vern kind of exits the scene in California, but he still knows all these guys. He still knows Chris Hillman, he still knew Clarence White and all these guys. And so he calls up, I think he calls Chris Hillman, or maybe not. It was Mark something. I think it was a producer that he called and said, hey, I want to make a record and I want Emmylou Harris to sing on it. Now, if you remember, Emmylou Harris was plucked out of obscurity by Graham Parsons during this time. She was singing in coffee shops and Chris Hillman is the one that introduced her to Graham Parsons. Like, remember that whole part of our Graham Parsons episode? Graham was looking for a female vocalist. Chris was somehow aware of Emmylou Harris and connects her with Graham, and that's kind of what pulls her out of the coffee shop scene. And then in the following years, Vern becomes aware of her and says, and she's kind of a big name now because him shooting his shot to get Emmylou Harris on his record was not a guaranteed thing at all. And he says that he managed to get her phone number through those connections, and he just kind of does a Hail Mary and calls this number, and he says that he thought he struck out because Emmylou wasn't home, and the phone was answered by somebody that was house sitting for her. She was like whoever it was, babysitter, house sitter, whatever. It wasn't Emmylou. And all Vern said was, can you please have her call me, Vern Gosdin? It's very important. And everyone was like, oh yeah, sure. So Vern hangs up and he's kind of like, all right, well, there goes that. And like, the odds of somebody like that actually taking the time to call you back, pretty low. But she does. So she calls him back a few weeks later. And actually, Vern had heard through the grapevine that she was going to call him because somewhere in here, I think Chris Hillman had run into her and she said, oh yeah, I'm going to help this guy in Georgia out with some song that he wants to do. And so in later conversations, he was like, well, I heard her talking about helping some guy in Georgia, so I guess that's you. And so sure enough, she calls Vern, and he's just over the moon. Remember, he's been working in the glass factory. Like, he's not active in the music scene, really. I mean, he's been writing, and he's been doing some of his stuff. Now, to be fair, Vern Gosdin initially did not think of himself as a top-notch songwriter. Like that kind of developed as he was already finding success. He started writing his own stuff. He was great at one-liners, and he was great at, he'd say something catchy and that would kind of, trigger the people around him, like, oh, we should write a song about that. And then he would kind of help, and that kind of drags him into the songwriting process to where he starts writing his own stuff. Now, so Emmylou calls him back. He's super excited. He buys her a round-trip ticket, I think to Nashville, is where they got this done. And his story is that he paid for a first-class ticket, round trip, wanted to put her up super nice. Emmylou decides, no, I don't need a first-class ticket, and she downgrades herself to coach or whatever, and then sends the change back to Vern. So she saved him some money. He was like, no, I don't need all the, here's some of your money back, which, he appreciated at the time and took that as like a sign of character for Emmylou. And so she comes and she, starts working with Vern Gosdin, and they crank out a couple of songs here that start to really kind of work for him. This is when so he had come back and he had got on with Elektra Records. I'm not exactly sure how that came about. I don't know what phone calls he made to make that happen, but by the time Emmylou is on the scene, you know, with him, he's back with Elektra Records. And I think the song that she worked on him with was Hangin' On. And that ended up peaking at number 16 on the country chart. So Vern is back with a vengeance here. That's a hit. Number 16 on the chart is you're in the money. And he proceeds to kind of go on a run of wins here. So we had Yesterday's Gone, Till the End. He had a few hits right in here. And things seem to be going well. Now, that's 1976 that happened with Emmylou. So in the years following, old Gary S. Paxton shows back up. And Gary Paxton is producing Vern Gosdin during this time. Now, we start to get some... in deeper, like, readings into Vern's personality, he was kind of a wild dude, and he had a temper. He had like everybody else at this time. He's doing the same thing. He's drinking a bunch, doing a lot of drugs, doing the rock star thing, kind of. And it is starting to shred his home life. And he was married to, I think he's married to Beverly at this time, a woman named Beverly, who she's the one that would later go on to write, she said she's working on an autobiography. I don't know if that was ever released or not, but I found some interviews where she's talking about this kind of stuff. And so she's the one that's kind of in his proximity during this time. So, and her description of him during that time is not great. I mean, it sounds like there was a lot of abuse going on, a lot of just drunken shenanigans. It was she felt, pretty tugged in all kinds of different directions and unsafe. So that is where Vern's head is, and the kind of personality traits he's expressing when some contract, disputes arise between him and Gary S. Paxton. And like I said, Gary S. Paxton insisted, he's a kind of weird guy. He insisted on being introduced as Gary S. Paxton. Like he was kind of insistent that they include the S when they introduced him to people and kind of just around town. And he had lots of his own catalog of successes as a producer, songwriter, performer. Like he was kind of his own, main character here. But his relationship with Vern Gosdin starts to sour here. And this leads to one of the crazier stories in country music history that I've found, and because there's a bunch of unanswered questions here. So basically, in 1980, so this is like Vern is doing well. He's all over the radio. He's got, songs all over the charts. He is not yet at his peak of success, but he's on his way. And he's having contract disputes about royalties and everything else with Gary S. Paxton. So, I think it was in May of 1980, I think. And Gary Paxton answers a knock at his door. And there's two guys. Both were named, I think, I don't know how you pronounce it, but one's Darrell, and one's Darrell, Darrell. Some of it's Darrell or Darrell. And the other one is Darrell, Darryl. So it's Darrell and Darrell. And their last names were Bailey and Langley. So Darrell Bailey and Darrell Langley. He opens the door. These two guys somehow convince him that they're in need of help with their van that is parked out front. And to Gary's credit, he kind of feels a little bit suspicious, but he's also, at this time, Gary's going through a bit of a conversion to Christianity. He's very, Jesus is at the front of his mind here. And he thinks, oh, well, what would Jesus do? I better go help these guys. But he was suspicious. So he takes his watch off and kind of empties the money out of his pockets before he goes and helps these guys. Sure enough, a fight ensues, and he realizes that he is the subject of a hit. That these two guys are clearly here to kill him. And they shoot him 3 times. Once in the chest, And I guess he managed to get his hand in front of the gun at one point, so like he gets a bullet hole in his hand, he gets shot in the chest, he gets a cut across his eye, they shoot him in the back, and there's like, and the whole time he apparently is screaming, "In the name of Jesus, you can't kill me." And they did their dangdest, because like I said, they leave him cut up and shot up in the ditch in front of his house, and the neighbors call the cops because they hear all the shooting going on. The Darrells flee the scene, believing that they have killed him, and police and paramedics show up relatively quick. They find Gary in a ditch. They get him to the hospital, and he survives this thing. Now, which is miraculous on its own. I mean, 2 guys are there beating the crap out of him and shooting him a bunch of times, and he ends up surviving. And so an investigation ensues and leads to the arrest of the Darrells. Now, this is where things get weird, because the Darrells themselves had no motive to do this to Gary. They didn't know him. They'd never met him. They weren't like involved in the music business. And everyone was kind of wondering, what's going on. Like I said, Paxton had a bit of a reputation as like this business shark, but he wasn't a bad person that everybody hated or something. And then in court under oath, those guys said Vern Gosdin paid us $200 to kill Gary Paxton, which obviously shocked everybody, because nobody, like, they were close at the time. Like, they were working, obviously, like I said, the relationship was strained because of the contract stuff, but they were, like, seeing each other all the time. And so apparently they had gone to Georgia, seen Vern Gosdin. Vern paid him $200 to go kill Gary Paxton because he wanted out of those contracts. And the weird part is that charges are never filed against Vern Gosdin. And the Darrells do go to prison, even though Gary Paxton quickly, and somewhat to his credit, I guess, starts talking about how he forgives them, and that it's like, again, he's leaning into his recent conversion to Christianity. He's yelling about, "In the name of Jesus, you can't kill me." They try, they get away, they get arrested, and Gary's first response is, "I forgive you guys for everything." But that doesn't stop him from later filing a lawsuit against those 2 guys and Vern Gosdin. Vern is named in this lawsuit for $2 million in damages. Obviously, because he's, that took him out of the music business for like 8 years or something. So it took Paxton out of the music business for 8 years while he's physically and, I'm sure, mentally and emotionally traumatized. So, like I said, it's weird that Vern was never formally arrested, never charged with a crime. There was never a clear answer as to why. There was no, like, they kind of just dropped the whole issue. And then that $2 million lawsuit appears to have been settled out of court because there's no record of how that was resolved. So usually when that happens, like, if there's a civil suit like that, or I guess it's civil, and there's a payout at the end, if they agree on confidentiality, nobody's allowed to talk about it. Nobody's allowed to talk about how much anybody got paid, who paid who, or why, and there's no admission of guilt. All we know is this $2 million lawsuit stops. The smart money says somebody got paid, probably Paxton. And Vern, and the other thing that kind of points to that is that Vern never talks about it. He never brings it up. And when he's asked about it, he shrugs it off quick. He's like, we're not going to talk about that. Like, I don't want to. Even in it wasn't really an interview. He did this kind of monologue. It wasn't an audio book, but there's a few things on YouTube you can find where it's all just Vern talking into a mic about kind of his story and kind of some interesting things that happened. And he just kind of glosses over this part where he was like, "Oh yeah, well then I was having some legal trouble that I won't get into here, but I went on and did blah, 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 blah." Like, just blips over that and continues with his career story. So, allegedly, Vern Gosdin got away with a murder for hire plot against his producer, which is wild. And I don't know who was greasing palms or why the cops never looked into that and why he was never charged with a crime. That's especially, it's like, pretty sure that's a federal thing if the deal gets made in Georgia, so they like crossing state lines to kill people and money's changing hands. Like, it is wild that nothing came of that for Vern Gosdin, but it doesn't. And then there's this kind of civil suit that gets hush-hushed at the end. And all in all, that does not appear to impact Vern's career very much at all. Like, he just keeps cranking out hits. And now, another thing to remember here. So Vern had gotten married to Beverly, I think in 1976. So she's married to him through this whole time. And this is kind of the time when he's like this drunk, abusive dude. He's touring the world. Like, him and George Jones get really close, actually. And they're, you know, having similar effects on each other. I think they get divorced in 1983. So Beverly has enough and she walks. Now, when I say she walks, she walks. She doesn't take any money. They did what's called a no-fault divorce. And what's funny about it is that both of them, like, there's some shenanigans going on here, because in interviews, Vern will say, we did a no-fault divorce, which is where, like, you know, I just gave her everything and walked away. Well, that's what she's saying, that she left with just, like, the clothes on her back and a small suitcase. Like that, she just wanted out of there. So they're both saying that neither one of them took anything in the divorce. But I think the smart money is on Beverly just packing her bags and getting out of there. Now, that does, you know, for all the drama, the songs that come out of this is where Vern Gosdin starts writing some of his best stuff. And it is heart-wrenching, and his reputation really starts to gain steam through the album that follows. So he writes an album called Alone. And that's where you get songs like That Just About Does It, and Alone, the title track of the album. And if you listen to that album, it's clearly written from a broken-hearted man at, you know, on the losing end of a relationship here. And so it's got this weird, you know, counter effect of shooting him into success and stardom. And let's see here. There was, and he's also, like I said, he's rubbing shoulders with all these, you know, different stars at the time. And he's, you know, I think Merle Haggard cuts one of his songs. He's on a plane with George Jones at one point. And the way Vern tells the story is that it was like 8 in the morning on a Tuesday or something, some like middle of the week day. They get on the plane and both of them are having cocktails. And there's this moment where Vern kind of looks at George and goes, we should kind of be ashamed of ourselves. We haven't even had breakfast yet and we're having cocktails. Like, what are we doing? And George was kind of like, what do you want to do about it? And he goes, maybe we should quit. And George goes, you know what? Maybe we should. Which is, when I heard that part of the story, surprising, because as we know, this is knee deep in George Jones being an absolute crazy person in this span of time. So they say, yep. And so what do you think we should do? Maybe put some money on it. And Vern says, yeah, how about $1,000? Like, we'll do $1,000. Whoever takes a drink first has to pay the other guy $1,000. And Jones says, sure, man. Shakes on it. Shakes Vern's hand. As they release their handshake, that hand travels over to that cocktail and he finishes it. And Vern is like, I guess you owe me $1,000. And that's when George Jones utters the line, I must have been drunk when I made that bet. And then that is one of those lines that kicks off a song that Gosdin writes and Jones records. And so I think the song is called I Must Have Been Drunk. And anyway, so that's a Gosdin song that George Jones picks up and writes after this interaction between the two of them on a plane. Which, like I said, interesting and funny, but also lines up perfectly with what we know of George Jones at the time. So, but like I said, so then, you know, let's see here. So, that's in the early 80s that happens. And then Merle Haggard, let's see here. Merle Haggard did A Taste of Yesterday's Wine. Or no, that was the album that song was on with Merle Haggard. So Haggard gets involved here. And now we get a little bit of tragedy entering the chat here again. When Vern's brother Rex, who has been kind of his rock this whole time through everything, Rex dies, I think, of a heart attack in 1983, and he was only 45 years old. So that obviously was a blow to Vern's, state of being. And Rex had his own. It wasn't like he was just cheerleading for Vern the whole time. He was his own kind of force songwriting and performing, and he kind of had his own career going. And but anyway, so the timeline of events here is like kind of doing the rock star thing, kind of gets away with murder for hire, his marriage falls apart, and then quickly thereafter his brother dies. And so the songs that are, coming out here in the mid-'80s are full of emotional delivery, which is, as you might imagine. And so one of them, If You're Gonna Do Me Wrong, Do It Right. And I think his first number one song, though, was Before. I gotta find that, because there was a story on the first number one song that he did not write. So Vern's first number one record had actually come a few years earlier in 1981. And it was written by a guy named Mark Wright at RCA. And the song was called I Can Tell by the Way You Dance. And there's just kind of a funny story here about how, like, this guy writes this song, hands the tape to Vern, and Vern doesn't really like it. He thinks it's too rock for his brand. And so he just kind of throws it in his catalog of stuff that he's, got with him. And but he doesn't record it. But every time he sees this Mark Wright guy, he's kind of persistent. Like, hey, did you record that song yet? Hey, did you cut that song yet? Like, what are we going to, Until finally one day Vern's in the studio and he's like, all right, how about we just try this song that Mark has been hassling me about for 2 years, and we'll see if it works. And then within 5 minutes, the band picks it up. It's working. And that song turns out to be Vern's first number one hit. And it just adds to his wave of success through the 80s here. And but like I said, then he goes on, after his divorce from Beverly, which was its own dramatic and just disastrous thing. He later said, I got 10 hits out of my last divorce, which is true, but kind of a calloused way of talking about that, I guess. But like I said, when you listen to the songs, he's clearly just crushed by this whole thing. But, and then let's see here. But yeah, so he starts, I think he wins a Grammy in 1983 for If You're Gonna Do Me Wrong, Do It Right. And that came from a conversation that he was having about his divorce, that he was basically telling his friend, like, yeah, we're just cutting everything loose, and, nobody's... And like I said, this is where he tells the story as if he just walks away and gave her everything. But, like I said, other reports say that Beverly is the one that walked with nothing. So it's a little confusing about exactly how this whole thing went down. But the song title comes from him telling his friend, oh yeah, it's a no-fault divorce, like, I just give her everything and walk. His friend is like, well, if she's going to do you wrong, I guess she can do it right. And that's, If You're Going to Do Me Wrong, Do It Right. That's the title of the song that comes out of this. And it just gets stacked onto the list of successes that Vern's got going here in this time. He wins a Grammy, or he's nominated for a Grammy for that one in 1983. And he just keeps cranking out hits here. Like I said, then his brother died in 1983. We're kind of jumping around the timeline a little bit here. And then the album's released shortly later. And then 84, he gets his first number one hit with the I Can Tell by the Way You Dance. And then he changes record labels here, somewhere in here. So in 1989, like I said, he's in the middle of a lot of turbulence here. And this is where he releases the album Alone in 1989. And like I said, this is where you catch a lot of interviews about him that, like, he's kind of at a peak of success here. Like, this is where his reputation is, like, solidified as a songwriter and a performer, and, like I said, he's known as the voice by all of country music while he's running around with George Jones, who everybody else said if they wanted to sound like anybody, it was George Jones. So he's knee deep in success, turbulence, and tragedy, all here in the late 80s. And let's see here. And then in 1990 is when he released his final top 10 hit, which was You're Heading Right in the Wrong Direction, and Is It Raining in Your House? Is It Raining at Your House? Sorry, which is a great song. I mean, like I said, all these songs, if you don't know any of the stuff about what's going on in his life, they're great songs. And they're just his delivery it just draws so much empathy out of you. It's so heartbreaking. You want to feel for that guy. Like I said, it's a little disheartening to find out kind of the truth of what was going on in his life at the time, and kind of what, the real character behind the music falls a little bit short of that optimism. But, I mean, as do they all. But, let's see here. And then, so this is where we start to his career starts to kind of taper here after that. So after the, early 2000s, he's winning awards and stuff. Like he is kind of in the tail end of his, fame and his career. But he starts having strokes. I think he had a couple of minor ones, in the mid 90s here. And there's a few interviews you can find where you can kind of tell, like it's kind of marked him a little bit. The way his speech is, and the way his eyes kind of dart around, and you can tell he's kind of lost a step in some of these later interviews because he's had a couple of minor strokes. And then, but he's, he continues making appearances and kind of doing everything he can. And then in April of 2009 is when he suffers like a catastrophic stroke and it kills him. And, he dies in his sleep in the hospital. Like right after. So he has a stroke, goes to the hospital, dies in his sleep soon after. Yeah. So it kind of, like I said, if you just listen to his discography, it's fantastic. It's some of the best performing and songwriting in the American canon of music. And like I said, he's just an interesting guy because he's bouncing off the Byrds and Chris Hillman and Emmylou and kind of all these other George Jones and Merle Haggard and all these people that we've done episodes on and talked about. And to me, he's just such an interesting character because he found success so late. Like I said, he's the same age, or he's a little bit older, I think. Or what did I say? I think he was born in 34. I think Jones was born in like 32 or something, like right in there. So he's the same age as George Jones, basically. And Jones was born in 31, so he's just a few years younger. And but yeah, it's just interesting to see him bounce off all these characters and have all this crazy publicity about him. But he's not kind of one of these names that keeps ringing out on the list of legends that you hear all the time. He's kind of an unsung musical hero in a way. But like I said, the closer you look, the messier it gets. But anyway, so that is Vern Gosdin. So thank you guys all for listening, and we'll see you next week.